So welcome, Marcel. Good to see you.
Thanks.
And it's a nice segue from Congressman Schiff from the House Intel Committee where you used to work, right?
That's right. And I can't let the moment pass without saying that Congressman Schiff and I have had a lot of quality time today. We had a hearing in front of his committee this morning on the relationship of the intelligence community and the military and a lot of the progress we've made over the last 15 years. So it was nice to have a chance to tell that story a little bit in the congressional perspective.
And we heard Director of National Intelligence Jim Clapper announced he's already handed in his resignation, which is news, but frankly, he's been saying that as a laugh line at conventions for a long time now. Like he says, I've got a calendar, and I rip the days off one by one.
That's right.
I'm looking forward to the end.
And he has retired at least 4 other times before, so I think I'm not sure this is a fully official retirement this time around.
Yeah. So have you put in your resume to continue on into the Trump administration as the Director of National Intelligence?
I think Director Clapper ought to do that. Yeah.
Okay. He might. All right. Well, thanks for coming. We know each other somewhat from previous positions. Marcel was a chief of staff and helped out with the transitions of 2 previous defense secretaries. So we've traveled the world together, and that's me with the press corps, him with the staff on the big plane, the big brisket, if you call it, many miles. So I've seen Marcel, Director Lettre, we should call him, come through different positions to where you are now, and you've seen for yourself the progression of intelligence, of the military's role in the intelligence community, this era of consolidating intelligence networks and databases and systems, everything since 9/11. Can you give us a little just to start us off, a lay of the land of how things have changed in that era since 9/11, since you've come in, where we are now, and as you expected to leave office soon, what remains unfinished?
Sure. Well, as you alluded to, Kevin, for years people thought that U.S. intelligence as a community had a lot of great capability, but was somehow sub-optimized in its ability to really deliver that capability in defense of the nation. When I was starting my career in the 1990s, I served on some research studies, a congressional commission and such, that pointed to what the 9/11 Commission and others found over time, which is that we really needed to look at new ways to integrate that enterprise over the now 17 intelligence organizations that make it up, so that the whole could be greater than the sum of the parts. And as we were talking about backstage, I came back into government shortly after 9/11, in part from having happened to be in New York during the 9/11 attacks and seeing the events of 9/11 that day through my own eyes, and the sense from that this was likely to be a long journey we were going to be on to battle this challenge that we faced. Brought me back into
tell
government.
people, what were you doing in New York on 9/10?
Yeah, so I'd come out of graduate school and was working as a management consultant, shuttling between Boston and New York. And late into the night of September 10th, I was working on a client presentation that was to be delivered on September 12th, and went into the office like I normally would on September 11th, 2001, and at 40th and Park with a good view of downtown. And we all know the events. The news started reporting about a plane having crashed into the first tower. Yeah. You could see it downtown. Kind of assumed that it was maybe a small civilian Cessna that had crashed into the towers. And then as the minutes went by, the second plane crashed, the recognition that this was a terrorist attack and a major event for our country, and certainly for the city of New York. Having been a former emergency medical technician here in the DC area, I looked for a way to participate in the events of that day, and
you went down there.
Went down closer to the towers and saw a lot of it up close and personal. So it was an experience, like for so many in this room, that was searing to me personally, but also reminded me of the long interest I've had to have a chance to serve and work in government on these issues. So it brought me back.
You worked as
EMT
EMT that day.
I did, although
Yeah.
there wasn't much to do, really. The response efforts that day were,
right.
There's a lot of capability available, but not a lot to do in terms of the rescue efforts.
So jump ahead. Here we are today. It's good to bring that reminder of 9/11 driving us and what's happening. We're still fighting the extremist terrorists, the output of that era. That question I asked at the end of my many questions to start. What remains unfinished as you leave office in consolidating intelligence networks?
Right. So what we embarked upon after 9/11 for intelligence through the intelligence reform legislation and a number of different initiatives by, at the time, the Bush administration, was really a transformation of intelligence that has now endured over the last 15 years. And it has fundamentally changed how we apply the intelligence tool in support of national security objectives, and for me, given my portfolio, in support of the military. The biggest thing that has changed, in my view, is that integrated effort. It's an integrated effort across 17 different organizations, but it's also an integrated effort across different intelligence disciplines, with human intelligence tipping and cueing signals intelligence and geospatial intelligence in unprecedented ways. All of this capability is most impressively witnessed in support of military and counterterrorism operations, where the intelligence community and the special operations community are working together through intelligence-driven operations to bring effects in support of CT and military operations in completely unprecedented ways. That's been a capability that's evolved over time to something that is remarkably sophisticated in its ability to conduct CT operations while limiting as much as is absolutely feasible the collateral effects on civilians and on infrastructure in areas that we're trying to target.
So let's segue then to those operations and talk a little about ISIS and as much as you're able to in a public forum. This is a war that is, I've said this previously in our events, it's a largely secret war. And it's on purpose. This is it's a policy decision to be fought by special operators and intelligence fighters or contractors working with local forces, foreign governments. It's the opposite of the big war of Iraq from 10 years ago. How is the intelligence community, or from your perspective, from your job, dealing with the public nature of a war that's basically on YouTube as it happens? It's on Twitter Live. It's literally on Facebook Live from Mosul, when it's being fought by what are supposed to be the nation's silent warriors that have this ethos of 30 years, 40 years back to Vietnam or even farther, where they're supposed to STFU and keep their mouths shut and not talk about it. But you have a public that's supposed to know about it, and you've got foreign media and foreign publics broadcasting it. Talk about the difficulties of it and what you think you're trying to do or could be done to maybe bridge that gap.
Sure. There are two dynamics that are changing the nature of these operations. One is certainly under the current administration, a strong sense from the president and the senior team that you need to be able to have transparency into the work that we're doing to reduce and eventually defeat or eliminate the challenge of terrorist threats that we face. And as President Obama has thought his way through this, we have developed a policy framework that provides for transparency and increasingly has certainly the Department of Defense informing the press and the public about key operations that have been undertaken in support of counterterrorism objectives. Even just most recently, a strike that we believe took out Abd al-Basit al-Iraqi, one of the key external operations plotters for ISIL. And the same could be said a few weeks ago when we believe we successfully took out Farouk al-Qahtani in Afghanistan, mm-hmm. one of the last remaining very significant core Al-Qaeda related plotters. So that a drive towards that transparency that achieves important strategic objectives in being able to demonstrate explain to the public what we're doing and why. There's another dimension which you alluded to, which is the YouTube effect, social media on the battlefield, where we're really moving from, to some extent, from an environment where we could operate covertly, in some cases clandestinely, in many cases, from secret wars to a low visibility warriors. Right. And that's a dynamic that is a little bit beyond our control, and we'll need to just adapt to it, because I think the successes that we've had in our military operations will, for a long time to come, fundamentally depend on our that combination of special operators and intelligence officers working in close tandem together, doing so on the battlefield with reach back to rearward deployed elements.
What does the community
being able to do
what's
that
the
in a way
community
that's
tell
effective?
you about this? I mean, the community, whether it's commanders at the 4-star level or the operators below who you go out with and see, are they concerned about it? Are they about public exposure?
Yeah, I think there's a mixture of concern and a recognition that the inevitability of this dynamic means we need to be thinking creatively and changing and adapting. Concern because it does start to erode that ethos that you mentioned too, of the silent warriors and the decades-long history of not talking about what successes we might have that were intended to have happened behind behind closed doors, behind secret operations, operational force postures. A recognition, though, that because it's inevitable, the only way we can really work our way through that is to continue to be agile and adaptive, and know that in that YouTube environment, we need to still find ways to be one step ahead of our adversary. And so a constant evolution of our tactics, techniques, and procedures, and our capabilities to do so.
So you mentioned a couple targets, senior leaders who were killed that the Pentagon announced, the government announced. When I was with Secretary Carter on the last trip into the region a few weeks ago, right after Mosul, they made a point of saying to the press that there have been more high-value target killings, as they're called, of senior ISIL leadership, and the claim was that that helped to degrade ISIS' ability to defend Mosul and attacking external plotters. And they even came out with a number of, I think it was 35 of those targets in the last maybe 90 days, 60 days, something like that, or months, I forget. There were some scoffs about that number and some questions about how much does that matter, because at least reporters will say this all the time, man, we've heard about these, we always get the senior leader for Al-Qaeda, for ISIS. I think it was Gates or Panetta who said the worst job to have was the number 3 leader of Al-Qaeda, because we keep getting the number 3 leader of Al-Qaeda. Talk a little bit about that, about first of all, what should the Americans know about the state of ISIS leadership and the importance of going after them, including Baghdadi, and we'll get to that. I know you know what I want to say. We'll get to that in a second.
Yeah. Well, overall, the overall approach that SecDef and other leaders from the administration's war cabinet here, the overall approach that has been articulated is one that puts pressure on ISIL across a range of its centers of gravity. Its senior leadership on the one hand, terrain that it controls, key capabilities, resources and infrastructure, finances, flows of foreign fighters in and out. Pressure across all of these nodes, to include trans-regionally, is really the core essence of the strategic approach. And as you point out, it's hard sometimes to look at one specific piece of that, and even though there are significant successes or advancements in tackling that particular piece, and expect that it's going to deliver a resounding victory. I think what we see.
So going after leaders doesn't end the war.
It doesn't end the war, but it's a necessary ingredient of going after this challenge that we face from ISIL.
So why is Baghdadi still alive?
Baghdadi is still alive because he's very good at staying in the shadows, and
you don't know where he is.
People are looking for him every day. Yeah. Baghdadi current leader of ISIL is an important figure for ISIL, and if we were able to take him off the battlefield, it would have an effect. But as you pointed out before, that's just one individual. The key to the military's campaign against ISIL is, in the military context, to apply pressure where we can as part of a broader set of tools that include the diplomatic, the financial, the intelligence, and so forth.
We talked about this, we met yesterday briefly, but I question, or maybe I should ask you, what do you think the difference between Baghdadi and a guy like Zarqawi was, where someone who was largely considered a real tactical operator, the actual leader of that organization that was running all the violence in Iraq back in the mid-2000s, versus Baghdadi, who came up a different way, is considered more of a cleric. Is there any truth that he's being allowed to be alive because he's just not as important to the fight or to the organization of ISIS as someone like Zarqawi was or bin Laden was?
I think it's more a function, Kevin, of the differences in how the organizations are structured as we understand them. When you look at Al-Qaeda immediately after 9/11 and for a number of years after 9/11, core Al-Qaeda was a highly centralized organizational model. What many observers of ISIL have seen is a more decentralized model to its operations. As we know, there's a center of gravity in the Syria-Iraq context, but even there, it's spread across that terrain in a significant way, and there's a trans-regional nature to its ISIL's efforts to establish nodes across different parts of the globe in North Africa and extending potentially over into Asia, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. So what that gets at is a little bit more of a diffused model, where one single leader under that diffused model is not exercising deep command and control over a large number of operations, but rather leading a looser network of individuals. It's why we remain concerned that even as we, I think, will ultimately be successful in removing ISIL from Mosul and from Raqqa in Syrian terrain, even as we are successful at that, we will almost certainly continue to face continued threats and challenges from affiliates of ISIL seeking to conduct external operations and plots, particularly in the Western European context.
Right. Well, you're not the first official to say that. The assumption is after Mosul, Raqqa, there's still going to be ISIS across the MENA and making those threats. Are you getting any intelligence wins yet from Mosul? The way we heard, I think it was Manbij, that you find laptops, you found all sorts of terabytes of information. Is it coming your way yet?
Well, it's hard to comment on this area in an open setting without getting into too many specifics. We expect that as we working with the Iraqi ground forces gain terrain in Mosul, that we will be able to pick up a lot of information about the state of affairs there, potential leads on the whereabouts of other actors that will allow us to keep fueling military operations. It's no secret that since all of us operate with devices and computers and so forth that now generate gigabytes of data, that as you conduct operations through a city like Mosul, you can pick up those kinds of materials and be able to look for clues as to what the next target ought to be.
Is there anything you can tell us that it's telling you what comes next, or what's expected to come next from the enemy?
No.
That's good.
No, I mean, I think, look, what we found is that over time, you hope that you find the so-called crown jewels in terms of an intelligence treasure trove, and what would
that even look like?
What we see is really a much more painstaking process of putting together bits and pieces of information that really characterizes the kinds of collection that we do come across today.
Do you have enough people to do the job that you're being asked to do?
In the counterterrorism context, I think what we found is we put a lot of our resources into counterterrorism as a priority across the intelligence community and certainly within defense intelligence. That raises questions about whether in a world of finite resources, we're underinvesting in other key challenges. You know, in the military context, we're also very focused on understanding how to counter Russian hybrid warfare and aggression, how to go after understanding the support we need to continue to deliver in Afghanistan, how to do cyber defense, how to operationalize the Asia-Pacific rebalance. In the intelligence context, all of these things need resources put against them, and it's kind of a zero-sum game at one level when you're thinking about what we've got today to work with. Now, that does lead us to the need to think creatively about innovation and where we try to build the next generation of intelligence capability. And in the military context, with Ash Carter and Bob Work pushing the whole department to be more innovative and more agile about building new capability, intelligence is kind of front and center in that. We think that the military focus on building a new offsetting advantage means that intelligence is likely to be at the front end of that advantage. And so our pursuit of things like artificial intelligence and deep machine learning and autonomous systems and human-machine teaming, all of these things are increasingly important to building the next strong military capability through the third offset that Deputy Secretary Work has talked a lot about. But it's also core to building the next set of intelligence advantages in the years to come.
I mean, you said zero-sum game. Is there a choice either way about building the workforce? I mean, we heard, I think, Hillary Clinton said a year ago that she would have had an intelligence surge, and Trump has kind of picked up on it as well. But what does that mean? Does that mean you need more operators on the ground and assets, I mean, in the traditional CIA sense, or is it more technology that's more bang for your buck?
Yeah.
From a military perspective, what
it's what does an intelligence surge really look like in the short term? It's a tactical level surge in capabilities, moderate redirection of human intelligence sources and airborne ISR platforms and what have you on the one hand, and a surge in creativity on the other. We have found that we do our best work when we outthink and outsmart the adversaries that we're chasing around. They're constantly adapting in how they're able to recruit through social media and so forth. We need to be constantly adapting that way too, and that just requires a surge in the mind share of our analysts and our collectors to be thinking through new ways and tactics and techniques to do things.
It sounds like a little bit of everything. You had mentioned earlier to me an example of someplace that there might be more need for the United States was in ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, especially drones. We've gone through a decade plus of heavy counterterrorism operations with persistent drones overhead. But what happens when it's the big land warfare with Russia or China or whomever? It's a totally different ballgame. Does the U.S. know how to fight, and is it prepared well enough with those same architectures of intelligence in the sky, fighters on the ground moving?
Yeah. It's when you step back and think about ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance platforms, which for the military cut across all domains: space, air, land, sea, undersea. But one of the most powerful trends has really been in that airborne unmanned ISR category. On 9/11, we really did not have an Air Force Predator flying in the air conducting real operations. 15 years later, we have 60 combat air patrols of Air Force Predators and Reapers flying, and that's going to be growing to 90 combat air patrols, to include some from the Army coming online as well. And that's an incredible scaling of capability, but it still is fundamentally about one airplane looking at, or a small number of airplanes looking at one target on the ground. As you think about the trends in warfare that we see coming up next, you see the need for the U.S. military to be ready to respond to contingencies against near-peer competitors or high-end adversaries who match us on a scale. and the need to be able to operate in denied spaces and in kind of a deep penetrating kind of way. And that leads you towards two things. One is we need to think about how to adapt this unmanned fleet over time to be able to operate increasingly against those high-end adversaries.
What do you need more of that you don't have now?
More range, more ability to penetrate into denied spaces. That might be the Gulf, the Arabian Gulf, the Persian Gulf, where you can't operate in a wartime environment without a lot of air defense and support along with you. And so thinking our way through capabilities that can be built into these platforms, and also all of the other infrastructure that goes with them. The other big thing that it leads you towards, though, is a need to think about how to scale to essentially an industrial scale. What we have now is highly manpower intensive. We have large numbers of analysts looking at full motion video coming off of small number of platforms up in the air, really, and sifting their way through the information that comes from that to do very precise, effective targeting, really in an amazing way. But when you then think about a hypothetical contingency in the future where you have to do that on multiple hundreds of targets, that really leads you to have to think very differently about how to scale it up, and leads again back to the kinds of innovations that DepSecDef, Bob Work, and Nash Carter are talking about around leveraging artificial intelligence and human-machine teaming and automation of a lot of our processes.
We're near the end of our time. I want to kind of completely switch topics a little bit about Russia. And again, you know this one's coming. I know it wasn't your call to say that it was Russia was involved in American elections, but there was a lot of reporting that said it was. First, it looked like it was going to be. Then the reporting said it was. And just this week, you have Admiral Rogers over at NSA Cybercom saying nation state was meddling around in American elections. But there was, and I'm sure still is, a large contingent of Americans who just don't buy it, who didn't believe it. What does that say to you as the intelligence chief at the Pentagon that Americans here is flat out, and even had the candidate himself say after an intelligence briefing, maybe not so much, that they don't believe what their intelligence community is telling them?
Two things, I guess. One, it was the intelligence community's judgment that the attacks, the cyber attacks, did have a tie back to Russia and to Russian governmental leadership. That was an IC assessment that really led by Director Clapper. The extent to which folks may not believe it really underscores the recognition that we're still working our way through a lot of the policy framework around cyber. And in some ways we're where we are now in cyber in a comparable way to where we were in thinking our way through nuclear deterrence in the late 1940s and 1950s, of having to think through the policy framework, how we talk about that issue to the public, how we attribute potentially attacks in a definitive way. And in cyber, it's really tricky because the attribution sometimes relies on very sensitive sources and methods, and it's just hard to be able to.
Even if you're willing to say Russia or China early on, the reason why that you can't tell.
Right. It can come down to easy to execute forensics that any cyber, any IT company would be able to do, as well as some fragile collection that might inform that. So it is a challenge. We need to continue to look for ways to be able to better build our ability to do the attribution and then to talk about the attribution. The other piece to that story, though, for me as a defense intelligence leader, is a continued recognition that we worry very, very much about the use by Russia of hybrid warfare techniques across a range of activities.
Such as?
Well, we're well aware of the efforts that Russia went into in the annexation of Crimea, and we watch very closely their activity in eastern Ukraine, and a sense that the little green men dynamic on the one hand, and the information competition tools that it uses to inject information that is false or inaccurate into the public debate in ways that are designed to kind of exacerbate fissures and increase the fragility of political stability in key regions like Europe. That these are tactics and strategies that we see Russia employing more of under President Putin, and that we believe require the U.S. military to think very differently about how to deter and respond to those.
So we didn't get to China. We're almost out of time. Again, gosh, I got a little more. But the J-20 plane just flew, and there are lots of different levels of concern in the press and analysis about that development. My question reminded me of when Secretary Gates went to Beijing back when relations were a little better, and that they ran a J-20 on the runway for the first time. The talk then from the military intelligence community was that we're getting it wrong in the prediction time, that every time the U.S. makes a prediction of when China was going to come out with new technology, China always came out with it sooner than expected. Is the U.S. getting any better at that, or are you still missing the pace of timeline of China's developments, and should we worry about them in the way that some folks do? A quick response for that one.
Yeah, we do see, in short, I think that dynamic is accurate. We do see from time to time indications that Chinese military modernization is occurring on a quicker time frame than previous predictions had indicated. A lot of that analysis is what informs the current administration's efforts at the Pentagon to really drive innovation through the third offset strategy and technology and doctrinal innovation there.
How do you get better at it?
How do you get better at
predicting
that?
What we're going to do next?
Well, we need to continue to invest across the intelligence community in both collection and the analytic expertise to be able to watch it.
Okay, we're over. I thought the clock was going down. Last question I have to you. So assume you'd only have a couple months left with this new administration coming in, but if today was your last day and you had to close up and lock up shop and left the office, what are your top concerns? What needs to be done?
Two concerns, really. One is, I'll say three. One is about continuing that intelligence reform that's occurred over the last 15 years. That transformation of intelligence, which really fundamentally has been about integrating the enterprise, integrating these 17 intelligence organizations, integrating the intelligence community, CIA, and the special operations community in an unprecedented way, and continuing that integration. It's something that is more of a journey than a destination, and we need to continue that journey under a new administration. The second is around the discussion we had around innovation and the need to keep pressing intelligence to new heights in terms of capabilities that are mostly about technology, but also about people and business practices and so forth. The third is on the current events front. The complexity of the landscape that we face means that we have to be able to think about Russia and cyber and Asia and Afghanistan and counterproliferation and counterterrorism all in the same fell swoop. But I think ultimately, to me, all roads still lead back to the counterterrorism challenge as one that we still have some work to do to get right in our response. And of all the things on that list, requires the most amount of hard thinking in the months ahead.
The response from the military response or the writ large?
Our entire counterterrorism response, yeah, with the military piece being a big contributor.
All right. The time goes fast. I could keep going, but we have others waiting. So please, round of applause. Thank you for Marcel Letcher, Undersecretary of Defense.
Thanks a lot.